Hello! It's the Great Canadian Banquet here, coming to you with a different video. I really wanted to cover the Brazilian presidential election the entire time. If you follow me on Twitter, which you should if you're on Twitter, for updates and stuff like that, I have been making the occasional post about it, maybe once a week or so updates. But I've decided at this point I can't do the same rigor of update as I would, say, for the US elections right now. I don't have the same high fidelity model that I'm using for the US. It would take too much time, and I don't have enough familiarity on the ground to calibrate it. So we don't have that. But what we do have is the next best thing. This is my low, quote unquote, fidelity model, which I have used before, and it worked well in Virginia in 2021, and it did adequate in 2020 US presidential. So, not the most sophisticated model in the world, but I think a decent one. Now, I have baked out some of the, or I've removed some of the assumptions that I normally bake into my models, and I will be going through the scenarios in a moment, but I'm just going to really impress upon people watching this. I'm not an expert in Brazilian politics. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in any politics at the moment, but I know less about Brazil than others, so I'm not going to go into issues. I'm not going to go into why things are going on here. I don't know enough. But I find this election very fascinating, and unfortunately, there is just not enough English language sources to really dive into what's for me to feel comfortable telling you what's going on. I have an idea of what's going on, but I don't feel confident enough to tell you. I don't want to stake claims on it because I could be wrong. Whereas Canada or the US or something, I feel much more confident in what's happening because there's more access to the media. I can talk to people easier, I can read the news easier, etc., etc. Well, with that, let us get into this. So this is the first round map here. I don't have a map for the second round because this is a lower fidelity model. I am not actually forecasting geographic areas. But generally speaking, this is the basic distribution for each party. The states that are in play are this guy, and this guy. I can't pronounce their names, so I'm not even going to bother. They're really the ones in play for Bolsonaro, and maybe you could argue these two might be in play because of the lower vote share for Lula. Not that geographic areas literally not that they matter at all in Brazil. This is just a popular vote election. But in case you're wondering on what places might have a different color on election day, those 5 states are the ones that might have different colors, barring a wild blowout. But none of my forecasts are really a wild blowout. So the first round we saw Lula here. He got about 48.4. Bolsonaro got 43.2, and then there's some other people falling off. And there was some pretty bad polling involved. So we see here, in the first round, not a single poll overestimated Bolsonaro, and only this poll here was even remotely close to his valid vote total. It was pretty close to his total votes, I suppose. And I would say this second Atlas poll was also close. So, there's one poll that was close. Zero polls overestimated him, whereas his opponent Lula had a couple polls overestimate him, such as this Atlas poll here, this other Atlas poll. A couple others got close, like this IPAC one, and several of them got under him. Okay. The smaller parties got wildly overestimated, generally, across the board. That tends to happen, though. So, in general, the first round here completely screwed the pooch. So, when I go through my scenarios in a moment, I really want to impress upon you guys here, that I don't really have any confidence in the Brazilian polls going into round 2 here. Yes, some people have argued the miss for Bolsonaro is heavily caused by overestimation of second parties and undecideds breaking late to Bolsonaro, but the election result was on October 2nd, and according to Data Falhalla, we had a 9-point break for undecideds and second, third party candidates to Bolsonaro in the last 24 hours of the election? No. No. What happened here was these firms who polled in first round that I have in this list here on Wikipedia, which is not all of the firms, by the way, and these are not all the firms that I'm actually including in the model. I have more because they're, long story short, there's been a whole nonsense about English Wikipedia on Brazil. If you want to follow the actual polls on Wikipedia, go to the Portuguese version. The English Wikipedia's had a whole bunch of dumbness. But anyways, you don't get error like that unless you're methodologically missing something. Either you are intentionally skewed, you are not sampling well, you're doing a likely voter screen that is completely wrong, you're not randomly sampling potentially. I don't know what it is, because I would have to actually look through all the methodology of these pollsters, and their methodologies in Portuguese, and my Portuguese is non-existent. But I can tell you this is methodological problems. And I don't really have any confidence that the methodological problems shown here would be resolved. Now, it might not be the same magnitude of error, because the second round is easier to forecast than the first round if you are polling, because you can ask somebody how you voted in the first round. And then you can weight your sample accordingly. So it's a lot harder to miss because in the space of 28 days, you're not going to get a very big change. If someone voted Bolsonaro in round 1, they're almost certainly voting Bolsonaro in round 2. Same thing with Lula. There is caveats there. Obviously, there is 28 days of campaigning. Things can happen. But generally speaking, you have the round 1 will limit round 2's error. But I still suspect we can't trust the polls as is. And I don't ever really trust the polls as is. I always have a error correction attempt. Forecast. Whatever you want to call it. But with no further ado, let's smash back to the map of Brazil, because maps look prettier. And let's dive into error. So again, here are the round 1 results. Lula 48.43, Bolsonaro 43.2, Simone Tebet 4.16, Ciro Gomez 3.04, everyone else 1.17. There was 118 million valid votes. Some of these were spoiled, and I believe some were returned empty. Let me just go back a second. Oh no, those are valid. It's okay. So there was a higher turnout than that 118 million, but about, what is that? 5 million were invalid or blank. So basically spoiled ballots, which apparently is pretty, I mean, that's pretty common numbers in a lot of places. So that's not that unexpected. So let me see here, the last week polling average, and this is where you really see how big of a miss this is. We're talking about an 8-point miss here. I'll just zoom in a touch to make it a bit easier to read. We have an 8-point miss for Bolsonaro. Well, 7.8 technically, but that's about 10 million, or sorry, just under 9 million voters. Which, again, to put this in perspective, if all of the undecideds, the entire overestimation of Simone Tebet and the overestimation of every other party combined gets you approximately this number. That's really bad miss here. You shouldn't be in... polls shouldn't miss like this. That's pretty embarrassing. Like, something really comically bad happened here. So, if we just scroll down here, we get to some scenarios. So this is for round 2. This is the base forecast. So my model, as you can see here, I have, these are all the polls, but this is a simplified model, I should remind you. I have these dates where I have pulled out numbers. This one, don't worry about it. The confidence intervals. And I do actually have confidence intervals here because my simplified model, since this is just a raw polling model, confidence intervals are a valid thing to do. All of my post-poll stuff is done here. Here, I can have confidence interval because this is just pure statistics. This is valid. And ignore this. This doesn't matter. So, as you can see here, Bolsonaro went into the first round about 39.5. Lula was sitting at 52.6. And in these the last 22 days, Bolsonaro's gained 5.3 percentage points, and Lula's lost about 4.7. Very big change, going from a 13.1 lead to just a 3.1 lead. That said, though, the confidence in Bolsonaro's numbers are increasing, so he might be approaching his ceiling, but I can't really forecast that because that starts going into statistic mumbo jumbo and isn't real. So, the round 2 forecast takes my numbers, 47.9 and 44.8. Oops. As you can see here, from October 25th, which is the day of this being recorded, or being released. Then you factor out the undecided here, and historically, Brazil typically has about a 98% of valid votes in round 1 or valid voters in round 2. Some people don't vote. Some people spoil their ballots and protest because their preferred candidate's not there anymore. So I'm forecasting that we're going down to about 116 million voters. Well, 115 and change. And if you take the undecideds and you do the thing that most pollsters do, especially in Canada, and you just remove the undecideds, or in other words, you say undecideds break proportionally for everybody involved, then you get this forecast. This, in Canada terms, would be what you would see a pollster or polling aggregator publish. This is the gold standard in Canada. And here we get Lula plus about 3.3, leading about 4 million votes. Though I will note here, I will just make this a bit bigger so we can see, and I'm going to freeze this so we can keep this above. That didn't work. There we go. And we're going to make this a touch bigger again. So, as you can see here, in this scenario, from the raw votes in round 1 here, Bolsonaro's picking up about 5 million voters, and Lula's picking up about more than 2, which shouldn't be surprising, because it looks like, again, most of these other voters, most of the Simone Tebet voters, are going to Bolsonaro, and most of the Ciro Gomez voters are going to Lula. This is the quote-unquote naive interpretation. This can work, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying naive to denigrate it. But I generally don't like these scenarios, and none of my models have actually ever been this. Anything I've ever posted on this YouTube channel has not decided undecideds this way. Because I don't like it. I don't think it is the best way to do it, and I think you will underestimate things because polls, even in good countries, have error, and you can forecast it because it is predictable. Because a lot of error in polling is not entirely the fault of the pollster, it is just predictable based on the methodologies being used. But anyways, so we go into scenario 1 here. So scenario 1, just to clarify, is my forecasting. This ceases to be pure statistics. This is now forecasting and projection based off of my assumptions and my understanding of elections, how you win elections, how voters vote, and what's going on in the ground. Take this with a very big grain of salt because I'm not very familiar with Brazil. I'm familiar enough to feel like I can publish this and I will have some facsimile of correctness, but I'm not confident enough to not put this disclaimer here. So, scenario 1 here, this is a pretty simple scenario. This assumes the undecideds break entirely Bolsonaro, because that's literally what happened in the first round. Again, we see here, you take all of these. I did the math wrong here. Apologies. You take all of those, and you get 800,000 fewer votes than what Bolsonaro got above polling. So, literally, all of the undecideds broke to him. Unless you want to be so bold as to say some undecideds broke Lula and the Socialist Party members broke Bolsonaro, which seems unlikely. Obviously, 800,000... If we assume the polls were correct and it was a late break, which is what the argument I heard is, 800,000 socialists decided to break Bolsonaro at the last moment, and the other 2 million broke Lula. I think the polls are wrong, but anyways. So if we assume the same thing happens, which is not a great assumption, this is why this is scenario 1. I don't think this is the best scenario, or the most likely one. But if we assume that the same thing happens in round 2, we get this one. So we have our base voter here. Bolsonaro wins all the undecideds, and then we get about 55 million for Lula and about 60 million for Bolsonaro. You might ask yourself, why would Lula be losing voters? Well, the general gist of why he might lose voters is people just aren't that excited. If people aren't that excited about him, they might not turn out. They might have turned out in the first round because you're also voting for Senate, you're also voting for House, you're also... more people are going, objectively speaking, etc., etc. They might have went for someone else in the last minute in the ballot box, strategically voted. Whatever. They might now be demoralized because it looks like Lula has negative momentum right now, so they don't go. There's all sorts of reasons why some might not go. And it wouldn't be unheard of. It would be a bit shocking, perhaps. But if we assume the pollsters' explanations why their miss was wrong, or such a big miss, is correct, it's not that unreasonable to assume a lot of Gomez voters, would-be voters, who broke Lula in the ballot box, don't go. That's not an unreasonable assumption. I don't think this is very likely because I think the pollsters saying that all the undecideds broke Bolsonaro is just insane. I think they just missed his numbers. But that's what it is. So now we're going to go to scenario 2 here. So I'm not going to go into scenario 2B. We'll loop back to 2B. But basic scenario 2 is, again, we have our base numbers here. These stay pretty constant. Not always, though. And then we factor in my forecast for polling here. This is not just based off round 1 here. This is based off of the last couple elections in Brazil. Because of the nature of Brazil and political parties shift a lot and we don't have the same candidates, I don't have as much confidence in this polling error as I normally do. But it is what it is. So if we factor that in, obviously we get numbers that don't add up to 100%. So then we normalize it. And then we get Bolsonaro's about 58.5, and Lula... Wait, that's not correct. Pardon me here. We get Lula's at 58.5, and Bolsonaro's at 57.2. About a 1.3 million lead. Again, this shouldn't be that surprising of a result, And this were to occur, because what that's basically saying is the other voters and Simone Tibet's voters, which is about, 6.3 million, break Bolsonaro in the second round, bringing him up to 57.2, minus some people who stay home. And Lula picks up some, but not all of Ciro Gomez's voters. About a third of them. Again, this is a pretty reasonable scenario. If I had to put something in it, scenario 2, I think it's generally the one I'm most confident in. This seems very plausible to me. This is normally how I would forecast in Canada, or the US, or France, or any other place I've ever done. So this is the one I am most confident in, scenario 2 in general, and we're getting to 2B and 2C in a moment. And we go into scenario 3 here. So scenario 3 exists because I'm not going to update this again before Sunday, when the election is. That's on the 30th. This is the only time I'm putting this video out. So scenario 3 is what happens if Bolsonaro's current momentum continues. And I have 2 levels of momentum. The first one is the low momentum scenario, which doesn't consider polls before the first round, which reduces the overall average weekly momentum Bolsonaro has. And then we factor that into the vote share, the negative momentum that Lula has, the positive momentum Bolsonaro has, and then we factor through and we get 51.24 to 48.76. And if we scroll back up here to compare to scenario 1, the base scenario, you notice not too much has changed. So that's 51.7 versus 48.3. And scenario 3 is 51.2 versus 48.8. So we're talking about a 1 point swing. Not very significant, but I think this is also a plausible scenario. This is my interpretation on this. Obviously, this isn't literally happening. But basically, this scenario is more or less saying 2/3 of Ciro Gomez's voters vote Lula, Simone Tibet's voters, and the other 2 meaningfully sized right-wing party, the other meaningfully sized right-wing party in Brazil. I think it's more like a libertarian party, but anyways, vote break Bolsonaro, putting him to about 56.5. Plausible scenario. I don't think it's the most likely one, though. Then we go into scenario 4. Scenario 4 is high momentum. Basically, this also factors in pre-round 1 polls, and this gets you a much larger number because you do 50.3 for Lula and 49.7 for Bolsonaro. Or it is because Bolsonaro has a lot more momentum. And again, here you're getting about a third of Ciro Gomez's voters to Lula, and you're getting pretty much all the other voters and all the Simone Tibet's voters. And if I'm pronouncing names wrong, I apologize. And finally, the main scenarios. We get scenario 5. This one just naively says the round 1 error is the same as the round 2 error. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it's basically the same thing. And if you do this, Bolsonaro wins 52.4 to 47.6. This one I think is the least likely scenario because we didn't see this in 2018. 2018 did not go this way. We didn't see this kind of error. There was error for sure in that polling, but it wasn't this bad for the round 2. If this happened again, I think most Brazilian polling firms should just close. They're terrible if this happens again. So we're going to go back up here, and we're going to scenario 2. We're going to scroll over to scenario 2B, and yes, I've lost other stuff up here, but that's fine. So this one, 2B, is if we have factored my error calculation, and we give Bolsonaro some low momentum for the rest of the last week of the election. If we do that, then we get nail-biting stuff. We have Lula winning by about 304,000 votes. Wow, that was really hard to say. I don't know why. That's very small considering 116 million people are voting here. Razor thin margin here. If this is the correct scenario, this is the one Scenario 2B and 2C are the ones I am personally most competent or most think are most likely. If it's 2B, read this as anything could happen on election night. When you're talking about 0.26% of the vote separates the leader, the winner, and the loser, anything could happen. That's pretty much a rounding error here. We go into scenario 2C. This is, again, what happens if you consider the high momentum scenario and my polling error. If you do this, then Bolsonaro's narrowly going to win, and he's going to get around 50.8 to 49.2. And again, Lula loses a few votes, about 400,000, and Bolsonaro more or less picks up all of the other and all of Simone Tebet's in a little bit. So I personally think 2B or 2C are the most likely. We go up here, we just have the ranges of possible. Because of how the quirks of the scenarios worked out, the range for both candidates is actually the same. Bolsonaro has a slightly higher base and a slightly higher ceiling by all, if you consider every scenario I've thrown out here. Realistically, I think we're looking at 2C or 2B or 2C, so I'll just maximize this so we can see better. There we go. Realistically, we're looking at these two as I think the likely scenario, so we could say perhaps instead we have that there as Lula's min, that as Lula's max, this is Bolsonaro's minimum, and this is Bolsonaro's maximum. And then if we do some spreadsheets live, there we go. And we actually get the same numbers again here for the ranges. That's interesting how that math works out. I guess it does make sense, though, because we're talking about the same number of voters here. So with two candidates, that should be the same range. But again, we're seeing relatively close races here. So we really shouldn't be... I would say at this point, pretty much anything could happen on election day in Brazil. I personally am inching towards Bolsonaro. He is down in the polling, but I think in my scenarios that, again, 2B and 2C here, I suspect he's more likely to win. If I were to bet money on it, I would probably bet on Bolsonaro, personally. Though I don't really bet on elections. Though my girlfriend always wants me to, because I typically have a decent track record at this. But again, I'll just emphasize here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 scenarios that, or 5 scenarios that Lula wins, and 1, 2, 3 scenarios that Bolsonaro wins. So technically, we're only talking about, if we just take this in absolute terms, this is not how this math works out, but we could say, in a really dumb approximation, that Lula has a 62.5% chance of winning, and Bolsonaro has a 37.5% chance of winning. That's not how that works, but we could say that. I'm personally going towards, it's probably closer to like 70% Bolsonaro wins, because I think 2B and 2C are correct. One of these two I think is correct. The question is, how much momentum does Bolsonaro have here? Because he clearly has momentum. Again, we pop over here. You can see his numbers are going up and Lula's are going down. Pretty clear, right? You all agree with me that? So Bolsonaro clearly has momentum right now. The question is, how much? If he has less momentum based on just polling since round 1, he's likely going to narrowly lose. But he could still win. Scenario 2B, he could still win. Like, if I were to color this on a map, I would be inclined to make this gray. Any state in the US, for example, that was a 1/4 percentage point between the winner and the loser, I probably wouldn't even color it. This is too close to call. Again, 300,000 vote difference here. You know how, like, that's extremely sensitive because we are forecasting a slightly 2.5 million fewer voters. If I'm wrong on 20% on that, that could drown out this entire lead. So that's how narrow this is. Just 500,000 people showing up to the ballot box, which is still a decrease in turnout, could swing this election here. So, 2B, very narrow. We give him the more momentum. I think he is like, he should win. But we'll see. Depending, if I'm right, and it is either of these scenarios, I'm probably not going to do post... Oh, don't do that. Don't do this. It is one of these two scenarios, and I'm right. I'm probably not going to do a post-mortem here for the Brazilian election. If I'm wrong, I will, though it would probably be a much shorter one because I have very low coverage and very simplified model. But overall, I'm willing to throw this out there. You want to know, you watch this whole video, who does Bagel think's going to win? I think Bolsonaro's winning this. He's down in the polls. But I think the indicators suggest he should narrowly win. This isn't one of my normal models. It's not as sophisticated as my normal model. But my gut and these two scenarios suggest he should win. Because, again, this is his worst case scenario in my mind. And his worst case scenario is too close to call. And his best case scenario is a small but decisive victory, if that makes sense. Like winning by 1.6, about 2 million votes. That's not a huge win, but that's a clear win. And it's possible he could fall somewhere between these two scenarios, and pretty much anything between these two scenarios is a Bolsonaro win as well. So, again, I really do think he's going to win. It's just, this is a very close race, and the polls really suck. So, it really sucked in round 1, so I just don't know how confident I am to say that. I think you should be very cautious in reading this. That's what I'll say here. So, with that, I'll bid you adieu, and on Thursday, I'm coming out with another Senate forecast. We have 2 more before November 8th, if I'm not mistaken, math-wise. And at some point, if you are interested, I'm probably going to relegate this to Twitter, so you can follow me on Twitter, @BagelPolling. I will be probably putting out a map for the core gubernatorial races, similar to the Senate map, where I'll have a bunch of races as just simplified models with yellow dots on them. But there is a couple of key gubernatorial races that I am directly forecasting, and those will be covered in that map. I'll be posting it on Twitter as I post other maps of things I do. But otherwise, if you like this video, by all means, press the like button, subscribe to the channel, share with your friends, let them know, get the message out. It really helps small channels like mine, because YouTube really likes it when you bring people to YouTube, and then they make my video go up in the algorithm. It really helps. It feels gamey, but game the system, and then I'll make money, and then I can be better. Do you want better forecasting? You gotta make the video be shared. Share the video. Otherwise, comment below what you think. If you think I'm off base here, you think I'm wrong, you think I'm misunderstanding something, I think I'm missing something, what you think is going to win, who you want to win, by all means, say all those below. I always find them really fascinating. I don't know how many people watching this will have any intimate knowledge of Brazilian electoral politics, but maybe some of you do. Sometimes I get viewers from random places. I have gotten a bunch of Bulgarians recently. Didn't expect Bulgarians to be watching U.S. or Canadian election forecasting. But hey, you Bulgarians watching this, you know who you are. Good on you. With that, though, I'll bid you all adieu and see you Thursday.